At 58 years old, Astrid sat in her Copenhagen apartment, surrounded by the symbols of a life well lived. 2 children thriving across Europe. A 32-year career in publishing, recently ended. A marriage of 35 years, recently transformed into friendship. And yet, something was profoundly missing. She caught her reflection in the window. Successful, accomplished, utterly lost. Is this it? She whispered to herself. Is this what comes after? That question would change everything, because what Astrid didn't know was that her family's Viking heritage held a secret, not about warriors or conquest, but about a phase of life her modern world had completely forgotten. A revelation that would show her, and potentially you, that the most powerful chapter hasn't ended, it's just beginning. Within 5 years, Astrid would start a business that reached millions. She'd discover a love she thought was behind her. She'd become the person she always wanted to be, but never had permission to become. But first, she had to understand one simple truth that changes everything about how we see this decade of our lives. Let me paint you the picture of Astrid's world in 2015. Copenhagen, winter. The kind of cold that makes you honest with yourself. She'd done everything right. Published authors who won literary prizes, raised children who were becoming remarkable adults, built a marriage that weathered the storms most relationships don't survive. Her colleagues respected her. Her industry knew her name. By conventional measures, her life was a success. But here's what the calendar pages didn't show. The growing silence at the dinner table when her husband mentioned his work plans that didn't include her. The way her daughter's voice changed when talking about Astrid's career woman years, as if they were a museum exhibit, not a living part of her identity. The performance reviews that started using the word seasoned in ways that didn't feel complimentary. The subtle reality that at 58, the world had begun looking through her, not at her. The worst part? She'd internalized it completely. She believed it too. My contribution was complete, Astrid would later describe that period. I'd played my part. Now it was time to step aside and make room for younger people to do the important work. This belief that life has acts and hers had ended was suffocating her. It wasn't depression exactly. It was something more insidious. The conviction that her productive years belonged to the past. That relevance was a young person's privilege. Astrid wasn't unusual. She was simply experiencing what millions of women and men experience at 50, 55, 60, 65, and beyond. The collision between a life well lived and the terrifying question of what comes next. The guilt of wanting more. The fear of starting over. The whispered suggestion from family, from culture, from herself, that this is the time to settle in, not reach out. The transformation didn't start with inspiration. It started with a book. Astrid's mother had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving behind boxes of letters, photographs, and diaries. Among them was a leather journal dated 1952, written by Astrid's grandmother, Ingrid, a woman Astrid barely remembered. One December evening, alone with a cup of tea, Astrid opened it. What she found astonished her. Her grandmother, at age 55, had decided to leave her marriage. Not dramatically, not bitterly, but decisively. The journal described her planning, her fears, her determination to build a life aligned with who she'd become. It wasn't a tale of liberation through conflict. It was a story of someone saying, I know myself now, and I deserve to live accordingly. What struck Astrid most was a passage written in Ingrid's careful handwriting. At 20, I was afraid of making mistakes. At 40, I was afraid of disappointing others. At 55, I realized I'd never asked myself what I wanted. I have maybe 30 good years left. I will not waste them being afraid. Ingrid had gone back to university. She'd studied anthropology, a passion she'd abandoned when she married. She'd traveled, she'd made mistakes and survived them. She'd become exactly who she'd always been beneath the roles that society assigned her. Astrid couldn't stop reading. That night, she did something she hadn't done in years. She cried. Not from sadness, but from recognition. She was having her grandmother's realization 45 years later, and she was terrified. Over the following weeks, Astrid began researching her family history with genuine curiosity. In library archives, she found records of her Viking ancestors, not the warriors of mythology, but ordinary people. And what fascinated her was the historical evidence of how Norse culture viewed the aging process. In medieval Norse culture, there was a concept called solskin, literally, the beauty of the setting sun. It wasn't a poetic metaphor to make old age seem prettier. It was a framework that said, you have moved through the first part of your life. You have gathered resources, experience, and wisdom. Now you are in the phase where your value shifts from productivity to meaning-making. An aged Jarl, a leader, didn't retire. He became an advisor, a keeper of knowledge, a shaper of strategy. His power wasn't diminished, it transformed. He didn't try to be young. He became fully, authentically old. And that authenticity gave him authority that youth could never possess. I realized, Astrid would later say, that I'd been trying to stay in the first part of the story, but a Viking woman my age wasn't supposed to be young anymore. She was supposed to be powerful in a completely different way. The decision came gradually, then suddenly. Astrid attended a conference where she met a woman named Helena, 68 years old, launching her first business. Helena spoke about it casually, as if starting something at her age was the most natural thing in the world. When Astrid asked what gave her the confidence, Helena paused and said, "Confidence? I don't think it's confidence. It's clarity. I've spent 68 years learning what I'm good at. I've spent 68 years learning what matters to me. Now I'm finally in a position to do something about it." That word, clarity, landed differently. It wasn't about being fearless. It was about knowing yourself so thoroughly that fear becomes manageable. Astrid made a plan. First, she told her husband the truth. She wasn't fulfilled with the life they'd built together. Not because he'd failed her, but because she'd failed herself by outsourcing her identity to the roles of wife and professional. She wanted to renegotiate the marriage, not end it, but reconfigure it. Her husband, after the initial shock, respected her honesty. Next, she articulated what she'd always wanted to do: work with older women navigating identity crisis. She'd spent 32 years in publishing. She knew how to tell stories. She knew how to connect with readers. What if she combined that with what she was learning about aging, identity, and the second half of life? At 59, Astrid started a small online coaching practice. She designed a course called The Second Bloom, a 12-week program for women 50+ who felt invisible and wanted to reclaim agency in this chapter of life. The first cohort had 14 women. The second had 47. By year 3, she was reaching hundreds of women across Denmark, Sweden, and beyond. But here's what matters more than the business growth: Astrid's personal transformation. She cut her hair short, something she'd always wanted but thought inappropriate. She traveled alone to Iceland and spent a month there just thinking. She developed friendships with women in her cohort that became the most meaningful relationships of her life. Her and her husband redesigned their life to include separate apartments in the same building. They could be together, but each could have independence. At 55, I thought my life was ending. I thought the best chapter was behind me. What I didn't understand was that I was confusing the end of one phase with the end of the story. The Viking concept I discovered, soul skin, the beauty of the setting sun, taught me something crucial. The light doesn't disappear. It changes. It becomes more golden, more honest, more beautiful because you can finally see everything clearly.
Now here's why Astrid's story matters to you. Specifically, if you're watching this at 50, 55, 60, 65, or beyond, you might recognize something in her story. That collision between accomplishment and emptiness. That voice suggesting you already played your most important part. That fear, that desire and ambition belong to younger people. I want you to hear this clearly. That's a cultural narrative, not a truth. It's a story your society tells, but it's not your story unless you agree to it. The first lesson from Astrid's journey, your value hasn't decreased, it's transformed. You're not trying to stay young. You're becoming fully, authentically yourself. At 20, you were learning. At 40, you were doing. At 60 plus, you have the privilege of knowing, truly knowing who you are and what matters. That's not less powerful than youth. It's differently powerful. The second lesson, you have permission to renegotiate everything. The marriage, the career, the friendships, the living situation, the goals. Everything that felt permanent can be reconsidered. This isn't selfish, it's honest. The people who love you will respect clarity far more than performance. And the third, the second half isn't an epilogue, it's an entirely new act. You're not trying to recreate the first chapter. You're writing something no one else can write. A story of someone who knows themselves, knows what matters, and is finally free enough to build a life around that truth. You also can do this, not because you have to, because you get to. Here's my invitation to you. This week, do one small thing that Astrid did in the beginning. Find something from your past, a letter, a photograph, a memory that reminds you of who you wanted to become before life assigned you roles. Spend 20 minutes with it, not trying to go back, trying to understand what that younger version of you was reaching toward. Because often, at 60 plus, we're not discovering new desires, we're rediscovering old ones. Write it down, not a formal plan, just notes. What did that version of you want? What do you want now? Where might those desires intersect? That's your starting point. And here's what I know. You're not watching this randomly. Something in Astrid's story resonated with you. Maybe it's permission you needed. Maybe it's proof that change is possible. Maybe it's just the reminder that this decade of your life doesn't have to be a slow fade. It can be a golden intensification of everything you've learned. The world needs what you're becoming, not what you used to be, not what you think you should be, but what you're actually becoming. The person shaped by decades of living, learning, and now finally choosing. If this resonated with you, truly resonated, I'd love to hear about it. Comment below. Tell me, what are you reaching toward? What would it look like to give yourself permission for this next chapter? And if you know someone who needs to hear that it's not too late, that their life isn't over but transforming, share this with them. Because that conversation among friends, among people who've lived, among people brave enough to start again, that's where real change happens. Thank you for being here. And I genuinely mean this. Your second bloom is not something that might happen. It's something that's already unfolding, waiting for you to recognize it.